Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. We've got a bunch of people online. I am Ros Tedford, and I am the sole person that ended up being able to be here live with you today. For my co-presenters who are virtual, we do have some people in the room here. And so I'm going to give an introduction to the session, and then we're going to move to the other speakers, and then I'll come back at the end and talk about a final kind of literacy. So Bobby, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks. So 2 years ago, which seems like 12 years ago, right? Sarah and Dan and I got asked to do a panel here at this conference on what was increasingly, right, becoming part of information literacy programs in libraries, which is teaching about mis and disinformation online. And we came from 3 different schools and we all approached it a little bit differently, but it ended up being this incredibly rich conversation, and people stayed after and talked to us and all of this. And it had been put together by Sage Publishing. And then, in case y'all missed it, sometime in early 2020, this pandemic hit. And then suddenly we were like, what can we do? And suddenly everyone was like, wow, we really need to be talking about all of this stuff that is happening with mis and disinformation. And so Sage Publishing put together, along with Dan and Sarah and I and some other amazing speakers, what they called a critical thinking boot camp for the summer of 2020. And it had a wide range of presenters, faculty, publishers, librarians from sort of all walks of life, sort of talking about critical thinking from a bunch of different perspectives. And then they did it again, as it looked like more conferences weren't going to be happening, but there was still this need to talk about it. And so we did a second critical thinking boot camp this past summer with some more amazing presenters and a lot of different faculty perspectives. And it was really an amazing day. And those recordings and everything are online for anyone who wants to do that. And maybe one of my co-presenters can throw those in the chat. We will upload these slides into Pathable as well, and the link is there. But all of that to say that in 2019, when we were preparing for that session, we were looking at what had happened sort of up to, sort of the spring of 2019. But even since then, what we've all really become aware of is that our traditional sort of notions of information literacy that librarians and even then faculty need to cover with students and with faculty and our interactions with them have gone way beyond the traditional find, evaluate, and cite your sources. And they've grown to include sort of this confluence of, we got to talk a little bit about media literacy. We really, especially over the last year, got to talk about science literacy. We've got to talk about data. And I'm adding into that algorithmic literacy, and I'll talk about that at the end because that is near and dear to my heart, with an eye for allowing our students and faculty to really address the challenges that were really highlighted through the pandemic, right? That we have this confluence, right, of people who are not data, science, algorithmic, media literate, and we have a role to play in that. And I think librarians stepped into those roles over the last 5 years pretty nicely, because a lot of us who are instruction librarians were like, hey, right, getting people to good information is sort of what we do. But I do think there's some opportunities, and different places have addressed this differently. So we're gonna first hear from Zina, who is a faculty working with graduate students, and she's gonna talk sort of holistically, right, about what this looks like with students in the classroom and the faculty perspective. And then Sarah's gonna talk a little bit about things that she's doing at Emory with media literacy. And then Dan will talk about science literacy. He's become my mentor in science literacy for sure. And then I'll come back at the end and do sort of data and algorithmic literacy and what we're doing at Wake Forest there. And then we'll have questions and answers. So we'll just sort of go in order and have Q&A. But at the end and in the chat, we would love to hear if you all are doing different things at your campuses. We hope people will come away with this with some ideas of, hey, maybe I can try that. Maybe that sounds like something that I could do without too much overhead or too much work. So with no further sort of explanation, I'm going to pass this on over to my colleague Zina, and she will start, and then we'll hear from Sarah and Dan.
Well, I've been asked to give you the faculty perspective on this whole issue around data literacy and media literacy. And as I'm sitting here thinking about it, when I was writing up my slides, thinking about what I wanted to say, it just really hit me how new this whole problem situation is. If you're old like me, when it came to data, when it came to getting information, we had the news, and then we had Encyclopedia Britannica. Anyone else ever have Encyclopedia Britannica? That was our go-to source for information, and you were at the mercy of whatever set you had. If it was 2 years old or if it was 20 years old, that's where we got information from. You went to the library and you get microfiche of old newspapers. It was incredibly difficult to get information, and so this is a new set of challenges. I remember the first time I went to the library and they told me that it wouldn't take 2 weeks to get a journal in, but there was sharing. I mean, this is all new problems, and it's a wonderful problem to have. This is one of the best problems we have, is too much information, but it leads us to the situation where we need to be critical consumers of knowledge, critical consumers of evidence and data to make that into knowledge. So there's a lot of data, but the trust that we have in that data needs to be down. It is down, but it needs to be down because we don't have objectivity in the way data is now coming through to us. We don't have objectivity necessarily in the way it's produced, but we certainly don't have it in how we can get to it, how it's presented to us, what's given to us. So we have tons of data, but our students haven't been equipped with the skills to really work their way through it. And that's the help that we need that comes from starting with the library. So data's up, trust is down. We also have to understand another change that's happened where information and news is now infotainment. And so that truth in news is gone, and we write stories. And we can write the story with whatever agenda, whatever bent we want. And we see such partisan manipulation of the news, of data, of the media. And these things are now intertwined. We had the concept of objective science, and that was supposed to be how we measured credibility. And that is something that is no longer making it to the populace or to the students when they're doing the research with objectivity intact. So we have data that is incomplete. We know that. We just have to look at what's happened over the last year with vaccines, and we'll stick with vaccines for the moment. We know it's incomplete data. People will still tell you, oh, the vaccine's safe. How would you know if it's going to be safe 5 years from now when we don't have 5 years worth of data? It is incomplete. Maybe true, may not be. We know that data is manipulated and it's tied to political agendas. We know that there are money is involved and power is involved. And you don't have to be a rocket science to know that. It is involved in all political agendas. We have a situation right now where big pharma is involved. That's all about money. So lots of money behind the way information is shared and what gets to our students. So what happens? Lots of misinformation out there. Just not correct. We have as much information that says one thing that says another. We have disinformation. A lot of mistakes being made. And then we have malinformation, people trying to give out the wrong information because they have an agenda at play. So this benchmark that we have always relied upon, the benchmark for science, the benchmark for data. Data is raw numbers. When we want to turn it into evidence, we have to make sure it's credible. And then when we want to use it, we want to use it wisely, and then it becomes knowledge. And the main benchmark that we have is objectivity, and that can no longer be assumed at all. We have no opportunity to assume that what is given to us, even if it has P equals less than 0.5 and it comes from a supposed credible source, the way we cherry pick the information, even good information, and put it out there is really something that is open to manipulation. And so we therefore do not have that objectivity. So what we're left with is a new situation where when I was growing up, we didn't have to question Encyclopedia Britannica because it was Encyclopedia Britannica. And we didn't have a lot of choice. Now what I want for my students is criticality. That critical thinking set that started off this whole process is absolutely essential for our students because they have to be critical data consumers. And credibility, I believe, needs to be explored across all sets of data, right? Any evidence that's coming in. We need to look at the sources of credibility. I am a researcher, and I need help in doing this. it is incredibly hard for me to sort through what is coming through as truth, what is coming through as evidence. It is hard for me to sort through the political agendas, let alone students. So, from the academic perspective, what do we need? We need our students to become critical data consumers. We need them to be able to ask questions of all the evidence. We need to ask questions about how data was derived, how it's being presented, how people want it to be used. We need scientists to become sociologists and look at political agendas. And we need our students to not only be critical consumers of data, but we need them to have a large level of reflexivity. Because the other thing we're seeing is not only the use of data that hasn't been critically analyzed, but we're looking at students who then become didactic when using that evidence, and they tell you what the truth is without acknowledging the question marks around that data or the alternating views that are out there. So we see a lot of didactic writing, and and the problem with this is that when you want to make a didactic statement, you can find the evidence to back it up at the expense of ignoring other evidence. So for me, what I need and what my colleagues need is students who are critical data consumers and really hold on to the reflexivity while doing their research and their writing, so that they have the ability to understand the importance of an open dialogue as they start to sort through the mass of information and data that exists in the world that needs to be used for the betterment of situations. And to do that, we need the help of all academics and everyone in the library system to get these students up to speed with something that certainly I didn't have to deal with when I was going through the system. So that is, for me, the academic perspective. And I think my colleagues on the library end are now going to share with you what they think, what they're doing to help in this endeavor, to help our students become more critical and be able to really hold on and use data effectively. So that is it from me. And I shall pass on to, who's up, Dan or Sarah?
I think I'm next. So,
all right, I'll pass it on to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Zina. That was really fantastic and a wonderful perspective to have. And we really appreciate you sharing all of that. So my name is Sarah Morris. I'm a librarian at Emory University, and I'm the head of instruction and engagement there. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about thinking about media literacy and ways we can weave this into work we do as librarians to enhance the things we've done traditionally and to, lead us into new endeavors and new paths forward in what I think is a really critical moment in our world, our society, and how people are, consuming and creating information and utilizing different, paths and channels and this very complex information and media ecosystems that we all inhabit today. So to start with, I'm sure many of us are very familiar with the information literacy definitions, such as ones from ACRL that we use in our daily work and our instruction. And something that's really struck me is the ways in which definitions of media literacy often have real overlap and echo a lot of things that come up within information literacy, which I think presents really interesting opportunities for people within libraries. I think an understanding of media literacy can really enhance the work we've been doing and continue to do in information literacy instruction and research skills instruction to empower students with really valuable skills. And it can also, I think, open a door for us to start addressing different topics like misinformation and getting perhaps a broader sense of sort of the media and information ecosystems we all inhabit. So media literacy, similar to information literacy, if you look up different definitions, often talks about being able to critically evaluate, access, and use different forms of media. But there's definitely a focus on both sort of understanding and analyzing media ecosystems, such as how things are produced, where things are coming from, but also on sort of using and producing media as well. So having an understanding of different tools and systems. And I'm mentioning these sort of information ecosystems. And, Zina really spoke very well about, the library and different ways we used to access things before. The internet has, suffice to say, been such a game changer that there's so many different channels where you can be getting information and content from. There's so many different places to go look for things, ways to produce, ways to get your voice out there, that I think it's critical for all of us to have an understanding of, how these systems work and to think critically about them. And something I think we can do in the library to empower our students, whether they're doing traditional research papers or maybe working on other kinds of assignments, other kinds of exploration, etc. So in my role at Emory, as I mentioned, I'm the head of instruction and engagement there. So that means I get to work with faculty and other library instructors to support information literacy instruction, which has provided some, I think, great opportunities to think about how media literacy and different things can be woven into things we already do, which I'll talk more about in a second. I'm also the subject librarian or the embedded librarian for our English and Interdisciplinary Studies program, which affords me the chance to work with both graduate students and undergraduate students conducting research, which is increasingly taking a lot of different forms, not just, traditional research papers, but people working on podcast assignments, websites, other things. And I've had the fortune to be able to offer some classes on misinformation alongside faculty colleagues in different disciplines, including political science, interdisciplinary studies, and American studies. So it's been wonderful to have all those perspectives come together on this incredibly complex issue facing us all. And we'll hear more from Dan in a minute about these sort of science literacy and Roz on sort of algorithms and other aspects of exploring misinformation. But to continue on here with this idea of this broader sense of media literacy, there's a lot of complexities to introducing students, not just to information literacy and media literacy, which we've been grappling with for a long time in libraries, but misinformation in particular. It can be hard to know sort of where to start and where to focus. And there's so many definitions floating around as well that can be complicated. I tend to subscribe to some that have been popularized by this organization called First Draft News, where they define misinformation as not always intentional. So something that could perhaps spread without sort of, malice behind it or some sort of intention. Disinformation, on the other hand, they often define as more intentional spread of false content. Malinformation can further complicate things with this idea of released content that might be true, but with an intent to cause harm. So as you can see, there's a lot of nuances here that can be tricky to sort of parse out and consider with students. So a question I've been grappling with for a long time now, along with Roz and Dan, who are fantastic colleagues and partners in this, is how to sort of proceed. So a couple of things just to share in my final minutes here. One is that I really do feel there's opportunities to draw on the information literacy instruction we've been doing and continue to do to sort of open the door to introduce media literacy and misinformation concepts to students. So much of our work has focused on evaluating and critically thinking about information, having an understanding of how information is produced, ideas of scholarly conversations and how people are kind of engaging and debating around ideas. Misinformation can fit into so many of these lessons just to give students sort of a richer understanding of these ecosystems we all inhabit, of the complex information environment we're all sort of grappling with, not just in our work and research, but in our daily lives. So I think there can definitely be spaces to weave that in, whether it's, a traditional lesson on identifying source types or search methods where you weave in things about algorithms, or, something about how information is consumed and evaluation skills that take into account forms of misinformation. Lots of ways to weave that in. And I'll do another plug for our bootcamp toolkit, which has some great ideas there. There can also, I think, be real opportunities here to support and encourage new types of research assignments with faculty. I mentioned my work with English department and interdisciplinary studies. So many people are turning to things like podcasts websites, other sorts of forums where you're sharing research through different forms of media, which is a great way to develop media literacy skills. And I think librarians are well positioned to collaborate with faculty colleagues to think about these new types of assignments, just to help students sort of get practice, develop different media literacy skills, and maybe kind of consider research and audiences and how they communicate through different lenses and in different ways. Finally, I do just want to note that there are definitely real limitations with library instruction, the way it's historically often been done. The bane of the one-shot instruction session is, I'm sure, something we can all commiserate about endlessly. And these topics are very complicated, and a one-shot often is not time to unpack all the complexities of misinformation. So I think this too could be sort of an opportunity and a call to, as a profession and within our campus communities, consider new ways of collaborating and offering programming. This content is so important, and I think librarians are so well situated to partner with people across campus to help students develop these really critical thinking skills, media literacy skills, information literacy skills, and start grappling with the challenges of misinformation. So whether that's, training other instructors, offering workshop series, things I've been doing, maybe co-teaching with faculty. Again, there can be lots of different ways to find ways to get this content out, and I think hopefully advocate for the importance of this type of instruction, of this type of learning, and partner with our faculty colleagues in this. So we'd love to hear from all of you if you've had successes or things you're considering at your own campus to get more of this information out there. Misinformation is certainly a critical set of issues and complexities and challenges. And I think media literacy alongside information literacy is an increasingly vital skill set for students to have. And we're already doing so much of this great work in the library. And I hope we as a profession can continue to sort of push this conversation forward and find ways to engage in this work in our instruction. So that was what I want to just introduce around media literacy. And I will hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Dan, to talk a little more about science literacy, which is another really, I think, key component and aspect to all of this. So Dan, I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. Dan Chibnall. I'm the STEM librarian and associate professor of librarianship at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. Just going to kind of tell you what I do at Drake and kind of how I teach and my role as a librarian, but also my role as a professor. So my main job as STEM librarian is to basically work with the natural sciences faculty and mathematics students and help them with their research, help them with their teaching. But then I also teach standalone courses. So I have 4 standalone courses that I offer throughout the year entitled Science Fiction, Science Fact, Fake News, Filters and Falsehoods, Communicating Science, and Science and Democracy. So I do a lot of one-shot sessions for science courses, but then I also do a lot of embedded work within the natural sciences and mathematics. So visiting multiple times throughout the semester, creating tutorials, videos. That way the students sort of get to know me a little bit better and can seek me out as a resource outside of class. And so what I'm trying to do is to integrate information literacy skills and science literacy skills both into my one-shot sessions, my embedded sessions, and my courses. And so what does that look like? Well, I am trying to help students see how scientific data and information are created and generated, how it gets processed and reviewed, and then how it gets to different audiences, specifically bridging the divide between technical in-group language publications and simpler out-group language, general public kind of media. And I often tell students that one of the most important skills to have in their science major tool belts is translator. They have to be able to teach others about the value, goals, and effects of the scientific work that they are doing or that they're helping to do research on. And so the process of how science gets produced and published, we all know has changed with things like open access journals and different types of publishers and publications. Plus, we also have the problem of things like blacklisted journals, poor quality publications masquerading as high quality ones. And so this is all new territory, not just for students, but sometimes for faculty. And so faculty will often approach me asking, is this a good journal? What do I do about this? How do I get this published? Tell me more about preprints. And so even though students won't necessarily need to know every nook and cranny of the publication process, I believe it's important that they understand how the system works So I help them view it from 30,000 feet so they understand how all of this stuff gets generated, where it lives, what people do with it, and how it gets translated so other people can understand it. In my courses, I also build a lot of assignments and activities and interactive lectures to help students learn not just how to translate academic and technical publications, but also how to get them to get the attention of people within what I call their personal and professional orbits. So it's a deeper conversation about values, geography, locales, finding local issues that tie to larger scientific issues, and using a little bit of creativity along the way. I call it the neighborhood and doorstep problem. In order to get some people to pay attention to science or to understand science, you have to bring the issue, the big, complex global issue, down into their neighborhood or to their doorstep. So how do you connect climate change to the local creek that runs, a couple blocks behind somebody's house? So those are the kinds of things that I'm helping students to do, to go from technical data and complex science and bringing it to a larger audience so people can understand it. And then you have the pandemic. So since March of 2020, my job has gotten quite a bit more interesting and busy since the virus has dragooned all of us into becoming science communicators in some way, shape, or form. Misinformation and understanding biology, biochemistry, epidemiology, these are all things at the heart of my lesson plans during these past year and a half, roughly. And so the examples that we see in the popular press that relate to the pandemic actually make it a bit easier for students to interact with the topics and see examples of good and bad science communication. So we can literally watch data and information move in real time as it relates to the pandemic and related issues. And so what we see too is that the public and my students have gotten a full dose of the role that, say, preprints have played thanks to the news media's grasping for anything that resembles scientific research on SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. One of the biggest issues with science communication, especially during the pandemic, is that science and the news media and the public operate at very different speeds. Science requires slow, careful processes, whereas people just want answers, especially nowadays, because they want to feel safe. And they want the media to give them those answers. So to embrace replication or understand why something was retracted, that does not always fit into the high-speed operation of daily news consumption and the regurgitation of it as all of us are sharers in this sort of sharing economy. So we examine how best to approach scientific information through the lens of the pandemic, since so many people have at least one eye focused on it. It gives the students a road that's already been built to travel on with the information they're trying to convey. They don't have to build the road and travel on it. The road is there. They just have to get the information out onto the road. And I also try to train my students to ask important questions when they encounter scientific sound bites, such as, what aren't they telling you? Or what more do you need to know? What is the context that's missing? And the other issues I have them pay attention to are who these scientific issues are affecting. And are those people part of the solution? So this allows students to see things related to concepts like environmental justice, gaps in public health coverage, and the lack of certain minority communities within STEM fields, such as women and people of color. So that's kind of a glimpse into the work that I do at Drake University with science literacy, my courses, my embedded librarianship, and teaching one-shots, especially for science courses. So I'm going to now pass it on to my colleague, Roz, and I look forward to any questions that you might have at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Dan. I could listen to all of y'all all day long talking about this, but I wanted to move and talk about our sort of third kind of literacy, and I'm sneaking in like a 3.5 kind of literacy in there to talk about data literacy sort of in light of what has been happening over the last 18 months to 2 years, because I think that, as Dan had mentioned, that's really become one of the sort of sticking points sort of across our entire globe is data literacy. But within data literacy, I also want to talk a little bit about algorithmic literacy. It's on my mind because I'm teaching a class on algorithms right now, but it is a kind of data literacy, but it's also a little bit different, and it bridges a little bit of the media literacy that Sarah was talking about. So my role at Wake Forest University is I'm a lot of things, but I am the politics liaison and head of our research and instruction department, and we teach credit-bearing classes oh Lord, we're up to about 20, 22 a year. These are elective. Most of them are half semester classes, and we teach them on sort of introduction to sort of library information and issues. And then we teach advanced ones on more very specific things, like I'm teaching one on algorithms right now. And then I also teach a first year seminar and have since the pandemic semester, we taught it for the first time in the spring of 2020, which was a wild ride, on mis and disinformation on the internet. So that's a full semester 3-credit class for first year students. And so that's my role at Wake Forest. I'll talk a little bit more about our credit bearing program in a little bit, but what we've seen, and this is not a pandemic thing, we've seen this over the last 5 to 7 years, is this increasing demand from students to find data and to use data in their own research. Always had been there, of course, in the hard sciences. We're seeing it at Wake Forest. Some of you may be at institutions where this has been true for a lot longer than for us, but we're seeing an increase in our social sciences of hiring empiricists and having actual undergraduate students do their own sort of empirical data analysis research. And then we have a School of Business that has its own like big data programs in that. And so students are wanting to find data, and then they're being asked to sort of interpret that data and then present that data in particular ways. And so over the last 5 years or so, in those sort of intro level classes that we teach, the credit bearing classes, we have done sort of your standard, like a 1-class session on like, here's what happens when you mess around with your X and Y axes. You can get the same data to tell 2 different stories, right? Based upon how you present it. And right, so that, I mean, that is like, that's within my Excel capabilities to do that. And that's pretty much the limit of my Excel data viz capabilities to do that. But we are seeing more and more of our students, and sort of parallel with that, and I'm sure you all are seeing this at your schools too, an increasing number of databases, right? Of actual things that we are either getting access to for free, so like the World Bank or right, those sorts of things, but also these things that we're paying big money for that are essentially all of these data, all of this data. And so a lot of those products don't come with a lot of context, right? That's one of the issues. And so students, they're like looking at this data and they don't really know what to do with it, and they're being asked to interpret it, and then they're being asked to do really awesome data visualizations, because that's what people do these days, right? They use these great data visualization tools to tell stories. And what we see coming in, and we're a top whatever we are now, I don't know, 30 private liberal arts institutions. So we're getting students from pretty top-notch high schools, but they're not getting those skills for the most part in high school. They're not coming with a knowledge of Tableau or a knowledge of even, R or any of those sorts of things. And we are sort of starting to see faculty who really want these undergraduates, right, to be doing these sorts of things. So we had that path was moving, right, long before the pandemic. But then suddenly you have this pandemic, and suddenly all of this data was getting shoved in front of our eyeballs, right, by algorithms and all this other stuff, while we're sitting at home and we're scared. And so you also have students and faculty and staff and all of us suddenly being inundated with these data points. And we're all realizing what it now looks like to live in a world where there's a lot of data and algorithmic illiteracy. So I don't know if algorithmic literacy is a thing. Y'all can like hashtag that or something and credit me. I don't know, but I'm starting to realize that really algorithmic literacy is its own sort of literacy in some ways, that we need to be really critical of how machine learning is serving us up information and what it leaves out, and what we can and can't do about it. And so that's, sort of an extra added thing. So it's not only that the data is out there and circulating and is getting attached to wrong, right, interpretations of that data, but it's then, because people are scared and afraid and angry, those things that make people scared, afraid, and angry, the algorithms are grabbing, right, and showing to more and more people. Which just spreads that sort of inaccurate data picture out there. And like, as Dan mentioned, and Sarah and Dan and I have had long conversations about this, it's a fine line to walk in teaching media literacy, science literacy, data literacy, algorithmic literacy with students who are 18 to 24 years old, and making them critical and making them skeptical, right? Making them understand that they need to dig in a little bit more and turning them to the point where they're like, well, you just can't believe anything you read anymore. I don't even know what to do. You're telling me that nothing can be trusted. And that's a very fine, like developmental, they come into college, very black and white thinkers. And to sort of ease them into the gray is a really tricky thing to do, especially when it comes to data, because, right, data are numbers, they should tell the truth and whatever. And as we know, right, they can be inaccurate they can be early data that may not ultimately pan out. They can be data that never gets replicated. They can be all of these things that sort of science moving at the speed of science, as Dan was saying, does not mesh with science moving at the speed of a pandemic. And so that's really tricky. It does test our skills. It makes us look for new things to do. And I'm going to mention a couple of things we've done in a minute. But I also think it provides this really amazing opportunity because our students and our faculty are hungry for this, because they suddenly are like, oh, like, I get it. Like, this is not a good thing. Like, we all need to be better. I've never had a more engaged group of students than I have in my algorithms class right now, because they absolutely understand the impact that algorithms, right, are having, and they really are hungry for this. It also gives you like daily examples, right, of bad data that you can bring in, like everyone reporting on the 9,000 people, right, in New York City that are city employees that, right, that have, right, been put on administrative leave because they didn't get the vaccine. It is less than 0.5% of their total pop, but everyone is focusing on the 9,000 number, right? And not on the larger picture. And that's just like that's an example from this week. There's a million of these. There was a lot of things going around about the media reporting on the percent of people in the hospital who were vaccinated, when what they really should have been reporting on were the people who were vaccinated who were in the hospital, right? Because that tells that is the more accurate picture, right, of what the risk is among sort of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated population. So you get these real life examples where you can walk in and be like, hey, look, right, this is an example of when you really need better data skills. The way we do it at Wake, we have incorporated into our one-shots. We have some amazing business librarians, one of them sitting right here today, and another one who will come into other people's classes and do sort of the, hey, let's look at what happens when you do the X and Y axis, right? So use those skills that you may have on your staff. As I mentioned before, we also teach credit-bearing courses, and we are incorporating that more and more, and have our business librarians and our social science research librarians like teaching courses where they're talking about those sorts of things in sort of a longer, not entirely semester long, but where you can talk about those things. We are also, we went through, our provost office has sort of an innovation grant program where you can apply for money for programs that help build faculty expertise on campus in some way. And we, for a while, had really wanted to do a program where we got faculty in and we sort of dug into the variety of these literacies and what we can help them with, right? And how they can incorporate teaching some of these literacies in their courses. And we were able to get a provost grant. So we had 13 faculty that went through it in August, and we're gonna do another 15, we hope, in a May cohort. And we dug into, with those faculty, very specific things about how you can teach about mis and disinformation, how you can teach about algorithms, how you can teach about data within a whole variety of disciplines. We had faculty from all over the disciplines. What we did realize, we got money from the provost, we were able to give a small stipend for that. But we also realized after feedback from the faculty that it doesn't have to be stipend based. Like, I think anybody could do this. Like, you can turn these sorts of things into workshops. Faculty are really hungry for this right now. And so we were able to and then we've in turn gone into a lot of those faculty classrooms this semester to talk about these very specific issues. So they didn't have to necessarily have the materials prepared. We would come in there. And so I think that's a really interesting way. So we will probably turn it in the future into these sort of like half-day workshops that aren't necessarily particularly financially problematic for schools who might not have that ability. And then the last thing, and I can't sort of emphasize this enough, is as you have positions open in your library, think about those sorts of things. We just hired, bless her, like 3 months ago came, right? Someone who, like, social science research was part of the job description that we wrote when we had a business librarian. So there's a business and social science research. So the goal of that is someone who can help our students and our faculty think through these data things. Teach has already come in with me to a politics class that's about data, to actually help students understand our data products, how to use that, how to tell stories. Our other business librarian also has data in her job title, and that's the sort of data discovery librarian, so someone who can help students. So we are thinking, as we have new positions open, how you can incorporate that skill set into who you hire, so that not every individual, not all 13 of us on our team all have to have that skill set, right? But we can then complement each other. And when I need Morgan to come into a class with me, I say, hey, y'all, you come talk about policy map, because I don't get all of those tools. But I can for sure do all the rest of this sort of thing. So those are some of the things we've been doing at Wake Forest. We are teaching some very specific, like I'm teaching for the first time this algorithms class, and sort of building in algorithmic literacy. And I'd love to talk to anybody about that, because it's my like consuming my every moment these days. But I think I have probably talked enough, and we have a few minutes for Q&A. So if anyone wants, y'all are gonna have to read out the Q&A from the chat, because I can't see that. But if anyone in here has a question, we got a microphone here as well. No question?
I think there was 2 questions in Pathable, but I don't know where they are. I think Jennifer might be reading them.
Yeah, I could read them. Yeah, there's been some great discussion in Pathable. So the first question was from Christy McDaniel. Sometimes faculty present the idea that if students just use the library resources, they are credible. I'd like to hear the panelists' ideas about how to communicate to faculty that peer-reviewed journals or library materials don't automatically allow students to turn off their critical eye.
I can quickly respond to that one just from a science perspective. I always, at least with my students, remind them, especially specific science courses, that yeah, just because something is in PubMed or Web of Science or something like that doesn't automatically make it like a silver bullet kind of, perfect thing. And so we go through trainings and we read articles about how do you read a scientific article and dissect it. And then we make a list of what I call green flags and red flags. So things to look for when you're reading an article. What should you look for in the intro? What you should look for in the conclusion, or the methods that might be like, it's a small sample size or something like that. And this varies from, discipline to discipline, but I kind of sometimes use the pandemic Swiss cheese layer of defenses, the idea that, physical distancing, masking, ventilation, vaccines, pills, those kinds of things. It's the same thing with quality with scientific information. You're going to have different sort of layers or going up the pyramid of quality. So I do try to incorporate that and remind them that not everything is perfect.
Yeah, I would echo that, Dan. I like your Swiss cheese analogy there. But yeah, 100%. I've certainly seen that in sort of undergrad classes I worked with, in particular, this idea that, they found a thing in the database is labeled an academic journal, it's good to go. So definitely try to emphasize like all, things like always just checking the author, and just take a few minutes and kind of get into that habit. And we'll often go through kind of exercises where maybe you're looking at an academic journal, but then you do the same sort of exercise, checking on the author, the publisher, et cetera, for a news article, for different types of materials, just to say that this is should be a habit, an aspect of being kind of media and information literate that shouldn't, pass by. And similar to Dan, talk a good bit about things like scholarly publishing practices and how this stuff gets produced. I find a lot of undergrads just don't quite even understand, how something appears in an academic journal, what all that entails, what sort of process it goes through. And so I think unpacking some of that and getting them to, just be aware of what the thing is and have those habits of, check on authors or different things can be super important, and certainly a good thing to connect with faculty. I definitely always encourage people to consider things like annotated bibliography assignments, because there's a good step in a research process where they can start building some of those sort of critical thinking habits and things. So thanks for that question. I'll see if Roz has anything to add, because I'm sure she has encountered this as well. There's Roz. Okay.
Yeah, I would just go back to that. You have to understand sort of what stage the students are at, and that it is really easy to turn an 18-year-old off of using library stuff if the first thing you're going to lead with is, hey, not everything is all that, right? So I talk a lot more about that with my senior political science students, right, who are doing this in-depth research. My the students in research methods class than I do necessarily with like my intro students. And I think it is true. And we are talking a lot about sort of bias in library algorithms in my algorithm class. In fact, that's on the table for next week to talk about that. But yeah, so I think you do have to sort of know your audience, and it is super easy just to make, just to turn students into total and complete skeptics of everything. And then, so why is this any better than what I'm just, going to find out there on the Google? So were there other questions?
There is one more question. It says from Danny, sometimes I'm so afraid of avoiding hot button topics, don't want to invite tension into the classroom, that I feel like the then watered down delivery loses some of its effectiveness and students are less able to see why it's so important. Does anyone have any tips for navigating these issues with students?
Well, I can talk about.
Well, I'm a big, sorry.
You go ahead, Zina, go ahead.
I'm a big proponent of evidence rather than ideology. And I think lots of times when we really get into the debates, we're talking about ideological beliefs rather than really relying on the evidence, which allows us to look at the quality of the data. So I know when I'm trying to moderate something that's getting a little bit heated, we try to identify where the heat's coming from. And it's not so much from the data, it's when we put our ideology on top of it, or religion's even a stronger form of ideology. So if we can kind of bracket that, and then we can talk about the quality of the science, and then your personal opinion after that is not really something that I want to debate in a research type science class. Maybe in ethics or something else. But so I try to separate that out so that it doesn't become, the science doesn't become tainted, and they understand the concepts of objectivity and subjectivity and when it's appropriate to rely on those things. So that's what I try to do in the classroom anyway. Roz, I know you were about to say something.
No, I was just gonna say the older I get, the less I have a filter anyway, but I do think framing is important, and I do think there's certainly enough blame to go around on some of these issues, but I also, I tend to hit them head on the first day and lay it out there when we're talking about some controversial things. When you start talking about algorithms and mis and disinformation, you're talking about some pretty negative societal issues. And so I try and get it all out there on day one so that students know that it's coming, and then I sort of, prime them for it a little bit later. It's never perfect on that. I've actually had more issues dealing with adults in sort of community workshops that I've done than on our campus with our students. So I've actually had more contentious confrontations in those sort of presentations than I have in the classes that I teach. But I do think we are at 2:15 and they're gonna kick us out of Zoom or whatever it is that they do. So thank you all for sticking around to the very end of the conference, and we really appreciate it. And you can certainly reach out to any of us with any additional questions. And everybody travel home safely, those of you who are actually physically here in Charleston.